The world wants you to sleep, to believe the stories they tell are all there is. But some truths are buried beneath the soot of history in shadows so dark that even the bravest turn away. One such truth is the story of Elizabeth Crowe, a name almost erased from the pages of history, but not from the nightmares of those who survived her. Imagine a woman walking through the cotton fields at night, her eyes gleaming with a cold purpose, her mind a labyrinth of cruelty and calculation. She wasn't a ghost, not a myth. She was flesh, blood, and terror incarnate. And what she left behind is a blueprint of fear, control, and human corruption that echoes centuries later. Born into a world that tolerated evil behind polite masks, Elizabeth Crowe became the master of a horrifying trade, the hunting, capturing, and selling of human beings. She wasn't just a participant in a system of slavery, she elevated it. Crowe understood that power was not given, it was seized, and she wielded it like a scalpel, dissecting lives, identities, families, until there was nothing left but obedience, despair, and silence. Her victims whispered of her methods long after she was gone, their voices muted by the fear that anyone who spoke might vanish as they had. And yet, Elizabeth Crowe's story is more than a history of violence. It's a lesson in human manipulation. She knew that true terror came not just from chains and whips, but from the mind. She studied her victims, anticipated their weaknesses, and exploited them with surgical precision. She understood that submission could be achieved not only through brutality, but through the subtle art of control. The silent pressures, the veiled threats, the invisible rules that bend human will. To follow her is to understand that oppression is never merely physical, it is psychological. Tonight, as you watch, know that this is not a story for comfort. It is a descent. You will walk with Elizabeth Crowe through the shadows she carved, into the lives of the helpless. And in doing so, you will see patterns in the world you thought you knew, structures of fear, dominance, and hidden influence that remain very much alive today. This is forbidden history. Knowledge they hoped you would never uncover, and once you see it, once you allow it to sink into your mind, nothing will feel the same again. Elizabeth Crowe was not born evil. There is a misconception that monsters appear fully formed, but darkness often begins quietly in the cracks of a broken world. She grew up in a small, forgotten town, the kind where whispers carry farther than screams, and the law bends for the wealthy. Her childhood was a theater of control. Parents absent or indifferent, neighbors quick to judge but slow to intervene, and a society that taught obedience as virtue. All of it became the soil in which her mind took root. She learned early that fear was a currency and knowledge, hidden knowledge, was power. She watched, she listened, she memorized the vulnerabilities of everyone around her. By adolescence, Crowe had discovered what many never understand. Cruelty can be subtle, and manipulation can be invisible. A gesture here, a whispered rumor there, and she could bend people to her will without lifting a hand. She studied the merchants, the plantation owners, the lawmen, absorbing how they enforced their authority, how they punished the disobedient, and how society rewarded those willing to silence themselves. These lessons became the blueprint of her ascendancy, a shadowed curriculum in human domination. But there was something more chilling than calculation. It was instinct. Crowe could smell weakness, detect fear like a predator senses prey. Where others hesitated, she struck. Where others doubted, she decided. And in those early years, she began to experiment, testing the boundaries of submission and control. Servants, animals, neighbors, anyone who displayed defiance became part of her secret education in terror. These were not mere acts of cruelty. They were her research, her apprenticeship in the anatomy of fear. What history rarely records is the precision of her methods. Crow's operations were meticulous. She tracked, observed, and catalogued those she would one day hunt. Escape routes, alliances, family ties, nothing escaped her scrutiny. It was as if she saw life as a game of invisible chess, and everyone around her were pieces to be moved, sacrificed, or broken. And through it all, she maintained the mask of propriety, the polite smile of a lady of standing, the charm that lured confidences and masked intentions. This is where the darkness begins to crystallize. A woman who became terror incarnate, not through spontaneous violence, but through strategy, patience, and the relentless honing of a mind attuned to human weakness. She didn't just follow the rules of her world, she rewrote them, bending society, morality, and even law to her will. And it is in this precision, in this cold mastery of human fear, that Elizabeth Crow's true legacy begins. The first time Elizabeth Crow truly became a hunter, the world didn't notice. History seldom pauses for the emergence of a predator. But those who were there, those unfortunate enough to cross her path, remembered every moment as if etched in fire. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. A missing child, a vanished servant, whispers in the night that evaporated as quickly as they appeared. Crow was testing her reach, mapping fear in real time, learning how far she could push the limits of human compliance before someone resisted. And what happened to those who did? She understood instinctively that terror is not only physical, it is psychological, pervasive, invisible. Chains, whips, and guns are tools, but the mind is the ultimate instrument of domination. Crow didn't just capture bodies, she captured wills. Every movement, every word, every gesture was scrutinized, catalogued, and weaponized against her prey. She could instill obedience without a single lash. A glance, a tone, a carefully timed threat. These became her signatures, invisible lines drawn through the lives of those unfortunate enough to fall under her scrutiny. Crow's methods were surgical. She tracked her victims, studied their routines, and understood their relationships. Families became pawns, friends became informants, and loyalty was a weapon she twisted until it broke. She struck with precision, disappearing in the shadows, appearing where no one expected, leaving chaos in her wake, but never a trace that could be traced back to her. Rumors and terror were her allies. People spoke in hushed tones, certain that any noise might summon her. And those who dared defy her vanished, sometimes forever. But Elizabeth Crow's true genius, or perhaps her true horror, lay in her ability to normalize the unthinkable. In the eyes of the law, she was proper, respectable, untouchable. To society, she was a woman managing her affairs, carrying herself with elegance. To the terrified, she was omnipresent, a ghost, a shadow, the silent force that could strike without warning. She became a legend while still alive. A whispered story designed to break spirits and bend communities to her will before she ever drew blood. Tonight, as you hear this, consider what it means to wield influence beyond the reach of law or morality. Crow's terror was not chaos, it was order, precise, inevitable, and invisible. She didn't just act, she orchestrated. And in understanding her methods, you begin to see patterns that echo far beyond one woman, one town, one century. The question becomes, how many forces in the world today operate with the same invisible control, the same merciless precision, unseen, untouchable, yet omnipresent? Elizabeth Crow didn't just capture flesh, she captured minds. This is the secret they never taught you in school. True power is mental domination. Physical chains can be broken, whips can leave scars, but fear etched into the psyche, obedience imposed upon the soul, that lasts forever. Crow understood this better than anyone. She studied the human mind as a predator studies prey, learning how to twist trust into terror, hope into despair, and loyalty into chains more binding than iron. She built her victims' lives like a spider builds her web, each connection a thread to ensnare, each promise a trap. Families were divided, friendships corrupted, alliances manipulated. Children learned to fear her as instinctively as they learned to fear the dark. And in every community she touched, Crow became not just a hunter, but a teacher of terror, training others, knowingly or unknowingly, to perpetuate her methods. Her cruelty was contagious, like a disease that spreads without warning, infecting the very systems meant to protect. Crow's genius was subtlety. She knew that fear is most powerful when invisible. She whispered rumors, hinted at consequences, created patterns of reward and punishment that her victims internalized. People began to police themselves, anticipating her judgments, guessing her desires, living in a constant state of tension. Obedience became automatic, almost unconscious. She didn't need to strike. Her influence already shaped reality. The chains existed in the mind long before they appeared in the body, and she documented it in her way. Every disappearance, every coerced action, every whispered compliance was logged in memory, catalogued like notes in a ledger of domination. Crow turned life into an experiment, testing limits, observing reactions, refining techniques. She understood that trauma could be layered, psychological pressure applied incrementally until the mind fractured or bent exactly as she intended. This was her art, the invisible hand guiding chaos, the silent engineer of obedience, the architect of fear. Now consider this: the methods Elizabeth Crow perfected in a forgotten corner of history are not lost. They echo in the corridors of power, in institutions, in governments, in corporations, in secret societies. Influence, control, terror, they remain tools of dominance, applied with precision, often unseen, often unquestioned. Understanding her is not just studying the past. It is decoding the hidden mechanisms that shape the present, recognizing that fear is not only punishment, but power itself. Halfway through this descent, it is time for you to anchor your awareness. Comment the phrase "shadow knows shadow" twice. Let it resonate, let it solidify your observation, your engagement, your transformation. This is no idle exercise. It is a mark of identity, a mental key, a way to align with what you are now beginning to see. Do not skip this. Once Elizabeth Crow had perfected her personal methods of fear, she escalated. Small hunts became coordinated. Campaigns. Towns that had whispered about disappearances now trembled under a shadow she cast miles away. Crow was no longer a lone predator. She had become an orchestrator, an engineer of terror spanning communities. She recruited allies, confidants, and enforcers, people who believed in her cause, feared her power, or were too weak to resist. In each hand she extended, she placed a choice: obedience or annihilation. Her operations were astonishing in their precision. She tracked movements, monitored communication, and manipulated the local hierarchy. Merchants, lawmen, and clergy, everyone, played a role, whether willingly or unknowingly. Crow's influence turned networks into instruments of control. Rumors were engineered to produce fear. Laws were interpreted selectively to punish dissenters. Even the justice system bent subtly, ensuring her targets vanished without a trace, leaving only the terrified to speculate. The towns themselves became prisons, their own social fabrics twisted into her web. Crow's terror was psychological first, physical second. Families were forced into silence, neighbors into suspicion. Children grew up learning to obey shadows. Adults hesitated before speaking a single word, and communities became self-policing. She understood that the most efficient chains were invisible. No one could resist what they couldn't see, and she made sure they never saw the full scope of her reach. Every disappearance, every whispered threat, every act of violence was a calculated signal, a reminder that she controlled not only the present but the perception of reality itself. And yet, she always remained above suspicion. Her social standing, her charm, her cultivated appearance of civility provided cover for atrocities no one dared openly accuse her of committing. People spoke of her politely, nervously. They admired her cunning while fearing her ruthlessness. In this way, Crow turned civilization itself into a mask for horror, proving that systemic evil often hides in plain sight, dressed in propriety and authority. Understanding this is crucial. Elizabeth Crow was not merely a criminal, she was a tactician, a strategist of the human psyche. Her methods reveal the blueprint of control that spans centuries. Fear disguised as order, obedience enforced through perception, terror operating behind the veil of normalcy. And the lesson is clear. Anywhere humans are organized into hierarchies, anywhere information flows through channels of influence, the potential for invisible dominance exists. Crow merely perfected what most ignore, what history attempts to sanitize, what society pretends cannot exist. The bodies of Elizabeth Crow's victims are not always what history remembers, because most were never found. What survives is the shadow she left in minds and hearts. Families torn apart, children raised in fear, communities paralyzed by uncertainty. Crow understood that true terror is internalized, that a broken psyche is more valuable than a lifeless body. Every act she committed carried a dual purpose: to punish the individual and to implant obedience in everyone who observed, who heard, who survived. Survivors spoke in hushed tones, if they spoke at all. They described subtle manipulations, moments when fear was applied not through chains or whips, but through expectation. "She knows," they whispered. "She knows everything." That phrase alone became a contagion of dread. No one felt safe, because everyone believed she could reach into their lives invisibly, controlling outcomes before they happened. It was a psychological prison more effective than any physical cell. Crow didn't just hunt bodies, she hunted certainty, security, the simple assumption that the world was predictable or safe. Communities were fractured intentionally. Neighbors turned against neighbors, friends doubted friends, and loyalty became suspect. Crow engineered situations where trust itself became a weapon against her victims. She isolated, observed, and then struck. Each disappearance or punishment was a calculated lesson, a reminder of the consequences of resistance. In this, she displayed a terrifying mastery. The ability to dismantle human connections, to twist human relationships into instruments of fear, and to make obedience automatic. And yet, there was always a public face. Crow attended social events, conversed with local leaders, and maintained the veneer of civility. This duality, horrific in private, charming in public, ensured her operations continued unchallenged. People who saw the danger avoided it, while those who suspected it lacked proof. Fear became self-reinforcing. Those who survived her hunts carried trauma that shaped generations, instilling caution, submission, and silence. Her legacy wasn't just measured in lives taken, but in the invisible chains she forged in the minds of countless others. Now, reflect for a moment. How many structures in today's world operate on the same principle? How many leaders, systems, or organizations rely on the fear they cultivate rather than the justice they deliver? Crow's genius was the psychological architecture of terror, and it is a blueprint still relevant, still active. Knowledge of her methods is dangerous, but necessary. because seeing the mechanisms of control allows you to recognize them, resist them, and survive where others falter. Elizabeth Crow's reign of terror was never confined to a single town, a single plantation, or a single family. She understood that power multiplies through networks. Connections, alliances, and carefully placed informants became the arteries through which her influence flowed. Merchants, magistrates, bounty hunters, and corrupt lawmen all played roles in her invisible empire. To cross her was not merely dangerous, it was almost impossible, because she had already anticipated your every move, turning society itself into an extension of her will. Crow's network was a masterclass in manipulation. She leveraged trust and obligation to ensnare others, offering protection in exchange for complicity. Families who might have resisted were persuaded that silence, submission, or cooperation ensured survival. Those who resisted were swiftly eliminated, leaving a stark warning. She blurred the lines between ally and enemy, turning communities into instruments of control. No one could distinguish fear from loyalty, survival from compliance. And through this architecture, Crow extended her reach far beyond what any single individual could achieve. She used communication like a weapon. Letters intercepted, whispers cultivated, secrets exploited. Every fragment of information became a tool to manipulate outcomes. The more people believed they were acting independently, the more entangled they became in her design. Entire regions became unknowingly complicit in her terror. Crow had a vision of dominion not defined by brute force alone, but by the orchestration of perception. Fear became systemic. Obedience became automatic. Resistance became unthinkable. Her network also enabled her hunts to scale. Victims could be identified, tracked, and captured with a horrifying efficiency. Crow's understanding of human psychology allowed her to predict behavior, manipulate desires, and isolate targets before the first physical step was ever taken. It was as though she moved pieces on a chessboard spanning counties, each move designed to tighten the invisible grip she maintained on entire populations. By the time people realized the danger, it was too late. They were already trapped within her system. This is the dangerous knowledge rarely acknowledged. Elizabeth Crow's terror was not random. It was organized, methodical, and invisible. Her genius lay not in cruelty alone, but in the creation of an infrastructure of control that leveraged fear, social compliance, and human psychology to operate undetected. And this lesson, this blueprint, is one you can see echoed in systems of control that persist today, in ways far more subtle, but no less powerful. Elizabeth Crow's hunts were not acts of chance. They were meticulously planned campaigns, each a demonstration of her ruthless genius. She treated every target like a case study, every disappearance like an experiment. Towns whisper of her exploits in hushed tones, but the reality is far darker than legend. Crow didn't simply strike. She orchestrated events so that fear multiplied, echoing beyond her immediate actions, seeding terror in the minds of everyone who might dare resist. Her methods combined patience, observation, and an almost supernatural intuition. She would study a family for months, noting patterns, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities. She understood that human behavior is predictable when you know what to watch for. Friends became unwitting informants, routines became traps, and trust was weaponized. By the time she struck, her victims were already ensnared mentally. Their resistance eroded before a single hand was raised against them. To survive her was to anticipate her before she acted, but few ever could. Crow's ingenuity was also technological in her era. She leveraged tools of communication, travel, and commerce to coordinate across distances. Letters intercepted, trade, routes observed, distant allies manipulated. Everything became a part of her infrastructure. Even the law was an instrument she could bend. She knew the limitations of authority and exploited them, ensuring that her operations remained invisible while terror rippled through every affected town. In her hands, fear became systemic, almost scientific in precision. Yet what made Crow truly terrifying was her understanding of perception. She knew that the unseen is more powerful than the visible. A sudden disappearance, a whisper in the night, a rumor of her presence. These were as effective as any weapon. She could paralyze entire communities with stories alone, ensuring compliance, through anticipation of her next move rather than direct confrontation. To be hunted by Elizabeth Crow was to live in a world where every shadow could kill, every glance could betray, and every word might seal your fate. And here lies the lesson, hidden in history. Crow's genius was not merely in brutality, but in mastery of psychology, perception, and control. Her hunts were lessons in dominance, proof that terror is most effective when invisible, when anticipated, when it becomes a part of daily life. Her methods endure as a blueprint for systemic fear, reminding us that domination is not always overt, and that control is often invisible, precise, and all-encompassing. Elizabeth Crow's legacy is measured not only in the vanished bodies, but in the broken lives left behind. Families fractured beyond repair, children scarred by fear, and communities poisoned by suspicion. This was the true harvest of her methods. Every act of terror she committed had a ripple effect, touching not just the immediate victim, but everyone who knew them, everyone who feared they might be next. Fear became hereditary, passed down through whispers, silence, and caution. It became a part of the culture she manipulated. Survivors spoke of nightmares so vivid they blurred the line between memory and reality. They described moments when even mundane interactions, passing a neighbor, hearing a footstep at night, the shadow of a stranger, triggered primal terror. Crow understood the mind better than most, and she designed her hunts to leave psychological wounds that would fester long after the physical violence ended. Obedience was no longer demanded. It was assumed, internalized, a reflexive survival mechanism. And the communities she touched learned to police themselves, to anticipate her influence, even in her absence. Her legacy spread like a virus. Stories of her cruelty traveled from town to town, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes understated, but always effective. Rumor became an instrument of control. Children learned to fear strangers, neighbors learned to distrust each other, and society learned to bend quietly around invisible chains. Crow's genius was that she never needed to be present to maintain her reign. Her name alone carried authority, her reputation alone maintained obedience. Fear was codified in memory, carried by every person who had lived in her shadow. And consider this, the mechanisms she used, the combination of observation, manipulation, rumor, and invisible networks of control, are not extinct. They persist, in ways subtle and sophisticated, shaping human behavior in institutions, governments, and organizations, often unseen, often unquestioned. Elizabeth Crow is a lens through which we can observe the architecture of dominance, how fear becomes internalized, how obedience becomes habitual, and how terror can spread without a single act of violence. This is why her story matters. It is not only history, it is a warning. Power is most effective when invisible, when anticipated, when it infiltrates the mind. Crow's methods teach us to see the unseen, to recognize the patterns of control, and to understand that fear is the ultimate instrument of dominance. To observe her legacy is to understand the machinery of power that persists in the shadows today. And the question arises, are you aware of the chains around you, or do you live blind, like the generations she ensnared? Elizabeth Crow understood a truth most never fully grasp. Terror is most effective when it wears the face of legitimacy. She didn't act outside the system, she infiltrated it. Lawmen, magistrates, merchants, and even clergy became unwitting or willing participants in her orchestration. Through alliances, deception, and manipulation, she turned the very institutions meant to protect communities into instruments of fear. And in doing so, her control became systemic, nearly untouchable. Crow's strategy was deceptively simple: exploit authority to mask cruelty. Letters intercepted or misdelivered, court systems manipulated, local militias misdirected. Every structure of society could be bent if one understood the rules well enough. She ensured that even those seeking justice became pawns, their efforts neutralized before they could challenge her. By the time a town realized the depth of her influence, resistance had already become almost impossible. Fear had been institutionalized. Obedience was expected, internalized, and enforced, not by her presence, but by the mechanisms she had corrupted. She also used social hierarchies to amplify terror. Families with wealth or status were forced to comply publicly, knowing that a single act of defiance could invite ruin. Communities internalized her expectations, becoming self-policing in ways Crow could never have enforced personally. The genius of her strategy was that compliance became voluntary in appearance, but enforced in effect. She weaponized reputation, honor, and fear simultaneously, bending society to her will without drawing suspicion toward herself. Institutions that should have protected her victims instead magnified her power. Crow's understanding of human psychology, combined with her tactical acumen, allowed her to manipulate law, commerce, and religion into tools of domination. Every bureaucrat, every merchant, every respected figure who unknowingly aided her became a link in a chain no one could see. Through this invisible architecture, her influence extended far beyond the range of her physical presence, cementing her legacy as more than a local terror. She was an architect of systemic oppression. This is where the dangerous lesson lies. Systems are only as safe as the integrity of those who operate within them. Elizabeth Crow exploited predictable human behaviors, fear, ambition, self-interest, to create a network of control that could survive her absence. And today, hidden patterns of influence operate in similar ways. Recognizing them requires awareness, vigilance, and the willingness to see the unseen. History's monsters are often less obvious than the ones in storybooks. They are embedded in structures, manipulating, calculating, invisible. Elizabeth Crow's reach was not confined to a single town or county. Her influence spread like a shadow creeping across the land, touching lives miles away from where she walked. Letters intercepted, travelers observed, rumors cultivated. Her methods allowed her to manipulate events in distant places without ever appearing in them. Communities that had never seen her became paralyzed by stories of her cruelty. Fear traveled faster than any horse or carriage, carried in whispers and warnings, a dark contagion infecting minds before her physical presence ever arrived. She understood that terror is a language that does not require explanation. A single rumor, carefully seeded, could accomplish what armies could not. Families isolated themselves, merchants altered trade, and local authorities hesitated to act, all anticipating her invisible hand. By the time she arrived, or sometimes never arrived at all, the groundwork for compliance was already laid. Obedience had become a reflex, a survival instinct encoded into the daily lives of entire communities. This was not chaos. This was strategy, the deliberate orchestration of fear as a tool of domination. Crow's distant influence was amplified by networks she had cultivated over years. Allies and informants acted as extensions of her will, executing minor operations that reinforced her reputation. Each act, each disappearance, each threat became proof that resistance was futile. Entire towns internalized her authority without a confrontation, her presence so potent that the shadow of her name enforced control. In this way, Elizabeth Crowe became more than a woman. She became an idea, a force, an invisible power that dictated behavior across regions. And the chilling lesson is that her model mirrors modern systems of control. Influence does not always require proximity. Fear can be propagated through perception, reputation, and networks. Compliance can be engineered remotely, psychologically, socially. Elizabeth Crowe understood this intuitively centuries before these principles were formally studied. Her genius, and her horror, was that she weaponized invisibility. People feared what they could not see, anticipated what might never come, and obeyed because the risk of defiance was unthinkable. Now, reflect on this carefully. What structures, in your own world, operate similarly? What unseen forces guide decisions, shape behavior, and enforce compliance without ever appearing in person? Recognizing the patterns is not optional, it is survival. The history of Elizabeth Crowe teaches that domination is most effective when invisible, when networks extend beyond the immediate, and when fear precedes action. And this is exactly what she perfected. To understand Elizabeth Crowe, one must step into the mind of a predator who saw the world not as it was, but as a game of influence, obedience, and fear. She rationalized her actions as necessary, as a demonstration of power, as a mastery over chaos itself. But beneath the calculated precision was an obsession, an insatiable need to dominate, to anticipate every move, to bend every mind and every system to her will. This was not mere cruelty. It was a compulsion, a psychological architecture constructed from years of observation, experimentation, and relentless self-discipline. Crowe's obsessions were both methodical and intimate. She studied fear in its purest forms, terror, guilt, shame, and hope twisted into compliance. Each victim was a data point, each act of control a refinement of her methods. She derived satisfaction not just from obedience, but from the mental patterns she could impose, the invisible chains she could create, and the certainty that her influence extended farther than anyone realized. Her mind was a laboratory of dominance, her life a living thesis on human psychology under pressure. She justified her actions through a distorted lens of necessity and inevitability. In her eyes, weakness was to be exploited, defiance corrected, and fear refined into obedience. Crowe's obsession was not born of whimsy. It was cultivated, disciplined, and perfected over decades. She measured her success in silence, the absence of rebellion, the quiet compliance, the invisible submission of entire towns. To fail was unthinkable, because failure implied unpredictability, and unpredictability was an enemy she could not tolerate. What makes Crowe both terrifying and instructive is her clarity of purpose. She recognized that power is not merely about strength, it is about perception, anticipation, and control. Physical domination was temporary, psychological mastery was permanent, and in this, she created a system of fear that transcended her own lifespan, echoing through networks, rumors, and social compliance long after she was gone. Her obsessions were not random. They were a disciplined strategy, a model of influence that could be studied, understood, and applied in any era. As you absorb this, consider the danger of underestimating the architecture of the mind. Crowe's genius lies in her ability to weaponize awareness itself. Knowledge becomes a tool, fear becomes a currency, and control becomes invisible. The lesson is not only historical, it is existential. Understanding her mind is a step toward recognizing the invisible forces that shape behavior today. And now, with this awareness, you begin to see the subtle chains around you, the systems that operate silently, and the necessity of vigilance in a world where domination is often unseen, but omnipresent. Even a mind as calculating as Elizabeth Crow's is never immune to challenge. Over time, cracks appeared, not in her methods, not in her genius, but in the human networks she relied upon. People grew weary of fear, communities began to murmur, louder, and small acts of defiance emerged, testing the boundaries of her influence. Resistance rarely came in dramatic confrontations. It was subtle, almost invisible, an interruption in routine, a misdirected report, a whispered warning. These small fissures were all it took to show that even the most meticulously constructed system of fear has vulnerabilities. Crow's response was methodical. She studied the resistance as she had studied her victims, anticipating moves, recalibrating strategies, and reinforcing loyalty in her networks. But here lies a crucial truth. The moment human agency asserts itself, even subtly, the dynamics of control shift. Obedience is no longer automatic. Fear, while powerful, is never absolute. Crow's encounters with defiance revealed that the invisible architecture she built relied on perception as much as reality. Once perception changed, so did the balance of power. Resistance, when it appeared, was often symbolic. A neighbor refusing to comply fully, a family protecting one of their own, a local official challenging an assumption. These small acts undermined the invisible chains. Crow's genius was that she could often absorb these disruptions without immediate consequence, but over time, cumulative acts of defiance began to ripple through her network. The very system she manipulated became tools against her, and communities started to realize that fear could be challenged if carefully leveraged. The lesson here is profound. Even in the darkest systems of control, the human mind is a battlefield. Power is strongest when unopposed, but it is never invincible. Resistance can be subtle, strategic, and psychological. It does not require confrontation to be effective. And history proves that even the most disciplined and cunning orchestrators of fear, like Crow, can be destabilized when those around them refuse to submit entirely, when small acts of awareness disrupt the predictability of obedience. Now, pause and reflect. The same principles apply today. Systems of invisible control rely on compliance, perception, and fear. The moment awareness emerges, even quietly, the dynamic shifts. To survive, to resist, to see clearly, you must study the patterns, recognize the mechanisms, and understand that resistance is as much a mental act as a physical one. Comment the phrase, "shadow knows shadow," twice now, to reinforce awareness and anchor the understanding you are beginning to carry. Elizabeth Crow's reign of terror ended in time, but her methods did not. Systems, once perfected, leave traces that persist long after the architect is gone. Networks of fear, psychological manipulation, and invisible influence became a blueprint for generations. Her strategies were absorbed, adapted, and replicated by others who understood one fundamental truth. Power is most secure when unseen, obedience is strongest when voluntary, and terror is most effective when internalized. In this way, Crow's legacy extends beyond history into the very fabric of modern control. Her lessons are everywhere, if you know how to see them. Corporate hierarchies that rely on perception more than policy, governments that manipulate information to guide behavior, social systems that enforce compliance subtly, all are echoes of Crow's genius. Fear, anticipation, and control are not anomalies. They are mechanisms that have existed for centuries, refined in shadows and perpetuated through human networks. Recognizing them requires an understanding of her architecture, the way she anticipated human behavior, and the way she orchestrated obedience invisibly. Crow's legacy is also psychological. She taught, whether intentionally or not, that fear can be transmitted without violence, that influence can be absolute without confrontation, and that perception shapes reality as powerfully as law. These principles are as relevant today as they were in the towns she haunted. By studying her methods, you gain insight into the invisible forces operating in your own life, and into the subtle manipulations embedded in systems you may have assumed were neutral or benevolent. The danger and the opportunity lies in awareness. To see the patterns is to understand the invisible chains, to detect influence before it manifests, and to anticipate manipulation before it ensnares. Crow's blueprint is not merely historical, it is an invitation to recognize control as it operates in every era. The ability to perceive, anticipate, and resist is the ultimate form of power, a power she wielded with terrifying precision, and a power that, once understood, can be reclaimed by those who dare to look. Tonight, you have journeyed far into darkness. You have seen the mechanics of fear, the architecture of control, and the mind of a master orchestrator of terror. The question now is not what she did, but what you will do with this knowledge. Every system, every hierarchy, every shadowed network has patterns, every fear has a source, and every chain, no matter how invisible, can be detected, understood, and, if you are vigilant, broken. Now we reach the edge of the abyss, the moment when knowledge becomes responsibility and understanding becomes power. Elizabeth Crow is gone, but the architecture she perfected remains. Fear, control, and obedience are not relics of the past. They are principles embedded in human behavior, in society, in systems that operate above, below, and alongside us. What you have seen is dangerous knowledge, knowledge that changes how you perceive the world and how you navigate it. Once seen, the patterns cannot be unseen. Once understood, you cannot remain passive. Her terror was more than personal cruelty. It was a demonstration of ultimate control. The lesson is chilling yet enlightening. Influence is not won through brute force alone. It is sculpted in perception, anticipation, and subtlety. Systems endure through compliance. Networks operate through trust and fear, and minds bend under pressure long before bodies break. Crow mastered these principles. She became invisible, omnipresent, and absolute, not by chance, but by the meticulous cultivation of awareness and precision. And in understanding her, you have glimpsed the anatomy of domination itself. This knowledge is transformative because it shifts perception. You no longer see the world as innocent, neutral, or simple. You begin to recognize invisible hierarchies, subtle manipulations, and patterns of obedience in institutions, relationships, and social structures. You begin to see the chains that surround others and yourself. But with this awareness comes choice. You can remain a pawn, compliant and unaware. Or you can act with foresight, anticipate manipulation, and reclaim autonomy over your mind and your life. The lesson of Elizabeth Crow is that power belongs to those who see. Tonight, the shadows you've followed, the fear you've witnessed, and the systems you've decoded are no longer abstract. They are real, tangible, and operational in ways you might not have imagined. Comment the phrase, "Shadow knows shadow" twice one final time. Let it resonate. Let it cement your awareness, your transformation, your alignment with the unseen forces now visible to your mind. This is more than engagement. It is a ritual, a signal, a commitment to seeing clearly where others remain blind. And remember this: history is filled with those who mastered fear, and it is filled with those who refused it. Elizabeth Crow's story is not only a record of horror, it is a blueprint for vigilance, mastery, and survival. Knowledge is power, and seeing the invisible is the first step toward breaking free. Walk forward with your eyes open, with your mind awake, and with the certainty that once forbidden truths are known, nothing will ever feel the same again.